Good afternoon, everybody. This is the closing. We have a keynote for Professor Hilary Janks. His presentation will be about interpellation in critical literacy, accepting and refusing behavior. It's really my privilege to introduce such a brilliant researcher, and I'm going to read short bio of hers, and then I'll give her the floor. So, most of you know, Hilary Janks is a professor emerita in the School of Education at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, South Africa. She is the author of Literacy and Power and the editor and author of Doing Critical Literacy. Her teaching are in the areas of language education in multilingual classrooms, language policy, critical literacy, and more recently, literacy in early childhood. Her work is committed to a search for equity and social justice in context of poverty. Please, Professor Janks.
Right. Boa tarde. But good afternoon, everybody. It is a real privilege to be with you, and I do want to thank Shizelda and his committee for inviting me to do this presentation, and I hope that you find it useful. Some time ago, I was asked to write about a concept that I work with that I found personally generative. And I chose to write about Althusser's theory of interpellation. That is what I'm going to be talking to you about this afternoon. And I hope that you find it as helpful for your lives and your teaching as I have found it in mine. So I'm going to explain the concept, and I'm also going to give you lots of different examples, and then I'm going to relate it to the work that I do in critical literacy in terms of reading with and against texts. So there are a number of expressions, let's see if this works. Yes, there are a number of expressions in English that capture the idea of interpellation. If a person provokes us to get a strong, negative, often emotional response, you can say they pushed my buttons. Teenagers are very good at doing that with their parents. Or they got my goat, or they needled me, or they rattled my cage. And name calling is a good example of this kind of provocative action. So I remember an occasion when my older son came to fetch me to console his younger 10-year-old brother. The two of them had been, that's my son many years ago. He's much older than that now. The two of them had been playing on a trampoline at a holiday resort when some bullies started my young son by calling him names. The name that reduced him to tears was Carrot Tops. As you can see, the child had magnificent curly auburn hair, which since he was a baby, everybody admired it. Even complete strangers used to go past and run their fingers through his hair, which, by the way, he hated. So this is perhaps why when people started attacking his hair, he experienced an attack on his identity. They had found a way to diminish and disempower him. He took the naming on board. He ran away from the trampoline, and they got what they wanted, which was the trampoline. So that's an example of interpellation. They called him a name, he took it on board, he was interpellated. So a way of thinking about interpellation is to think as So the inter means between. It's something that happens between people. And appellation is actually the it's actually the Latin word pronounced appellatione, and it means to call somebody a name, to designate to somebody. It's about calling somebody into a particular subject position. And if that name calling is taken on board, then positioning has been accomplished. So I like to think of it in relation to the image that you see here, which is of a fisherman who sets out with his bait on a hook, trying to get you to take the bait, and then he reels you in. But if you don't close your mouth and take the bait, you haven't been interpellated. In other words, if the name calling or the position doesn't work, then interpellation hasn't taken place. So the between is a really important part of this concept. It's a two-way process. In order for the power play to work, the person being named has to take up the naming and respond to the provocation. The person has to swallow the bait. In accepting the subject position created by someone's naming of us, we surrender to the power of the interpellator, to the name caller. If we don't surrender, if we don't take it on board, then without this acceptance, it's boring. So this is a concept from Althusser, and he explains it thus. He says, ideology acts or functions in such a way, I mean, you can read it for yourself, okay? It recruits subjects among individuals, transforming individuals into subjects. And then he gives the example of you're walking down the street and you see a policeman and you hear him hailing and he says, "Hey, you." Now, if you think that that call is for you, if you think that innocently walking down the street, the policeman might be hailing you, then already you're interpolating. And Althusser says the hailed individual, and by this 180-degree physical turn, conversion, he becomes a subject. Why? Because he's recognized that the hail was really addressed to him, and it was really him who was hailed and not somebody else. So it's really important to see that you accept the hail. You have to see and recognize that the hail is directed to you. So I'm going to give you some personal examples, which I think will help you to see how this works. So the first example was when I was a young academic, I had a male colleague who really knew how to get under my skin, psychologically speaking. He could undermine my self-confidence, make me question my every move, and I felt that he was manipulating me in order to have power over me. But even though I recognized that, his barbs, they got through, they hit home, and they destabilized me. Now, I remember one occasion when he criticized something I did. I don't remember what I did, and said I was ambitious, but in a way, a very disapproving way. And at the time, it felt like an attack on my being, in much the same way as with my son. I felt I was being attacked. And it was only after I learned about Althusser's concept of interpellation that I was able to resist his bait. And it gave me great satisfaction that it was he who taught me about interpellation in a course that he was giving that I was auditing. So it took me some time to realize that my colleague didn't actually know how to hook me. He would always put out little bits of bait. He would go on fishing expeditions. He'd throw out this bit of bait, he'd throw out that. waiting to see what I would swallow. And I had to choose to come to my own persecution party. Once I could see how this worked, I was on the lookout, and I was able to attempt to resist his attempts to reel me in. Now, this kind of manipulative, interpolative move is, of course, much easier to spot in someone who does it often. So being able to see the bait for what it was, not a real reflection on who I was, really I found incredibly liberating, because I could start to think about the different kinds of bait that I responded to and to understand myself better. I was even able to think about why it was okay for men to be ambitious. I was able to recognize masculinity at work in these attacks and to refuse either the naming itself, as in actually I'm not inappropriately ambitious, or the negative positions that are associated with it for women, as in women are not allowed to be ambitious. You know, I could say, well, why not? You know, is it bad to want to achieve? And recently, when Senator Kamala Harris was named as Biden's deputy, they immediately said that she was ambitious. And nowadays, this was called out almost instantly as a sexist slur. So, I mean, 30 years ago, I wasn't as wise or aware of these things as I am now, or I would have just called him on being sexist. I also had to deal with a male relative, somebody in the family, who specialized in being obnoxious. Now, his tactic, and he didn't only use it with me, he used it with lots of people, were to find out what what was sacred to the person, and then to attack whatever was sacred to that person, to get a rise out of that person, to get a reaction. He thrived off the reactions. So with me, he would deliberately make sexist, racist, or homophobic remarks. And I used to get into a roaring argument with him, which is exactly what he wanted. So it took me a while to realize that the best way was not to allow him to push my buttons. So I came to understand that not responding to his calls didn't make me complicit. And so I started to ignore them. And the funny thing is, the more I ignored them, the more he stopped using them. They went away. In other words, I wasn't feeding his need for a response. So I realized that it takes two to tango. And I learned not to be part of that destructive dance. I've no doubt, in fact, I know that he's moved on to look for other willing victims, but now that his daughters have grown up, they keep him in check and I'm off the hook. So that's another example. So, you know, interpellation is always personal. It's always about power, and it always aims to get you in areas where you, for whatever reason, are vulnerable. Now, this is Trump's tweet about Elizabeth Warren. Goofy Elizabeth Warren, sometimes referred to as Pocahontas, pretended to be a Native American in order to advance her career. Very racist. So he constantly referred to her as faking being a Native American. And the question I'm asking here is, did she accept the hail? Can we see her turning that 180 degrees to respond to the hail? And yes, she did. She responded by having a DNA test and publishing the results. And then, of course, she offended many Native Americans who criticized Warren for reducing tribal membership to genetics. So she responds to the subsequent hail by apologizing for the harm that she did to Native Americans. So in taking up Trump's hail, she then has to deal with the hail from people that she really cares about. So Trump exemplifies the use of derogatory naming. Let me go to the next slide. He does it to sow doubt about his enemies and to incite his conservative supporters. The birther conspiracy about Obama is a classic example, and it ultimately forced Obama to make his birth certificate public, which is another form of turning around 180 degrees. He often projects his own faults onto others to deflect criticism away from itself so that it sticks to somebody else instead. Trump demands loyalty and he rules by fear and repression. He mocks and derides people who cross him. And people are so afraid of his interpellations that they don't cross him. And it inhibits them from acting against him. But this is only part of the story. Interpellation is insidious because it works below the level of consciousness. The examples above show the work required to bring it to the level of consciousness. However, even thinking about the naming in order to counter it or deal with it, even if you don't deal with it overtly, means that somehow you've heard it. Okay, it's penetrated. And in order to show the unconscious effects of interpellation, even if you see it coming, and it can work on you unconsciously. So my next example comes from when I was a doctoral student. I did my doctoral studies late, and by the time I registered for my doctorate, I'd already been an academic for 12 years. I published already, and I really resented being positioned as a student, as somebody who was expected to imbibe stuff from the lecturers and just be a docile student. I found that very difficult. So I was quite contentious as a student. I questioned everything. I wouldn't take things on board without actually really thinking them through and discussing them. So the one evening we had a seminar for postgraduate students, just postgraduate students, and my supervisor, who had been working with me the whole afternoon looking at the early versions of my critical language awareness materials, was giving this very abstract talk. And somebody in the talk asked him, you know, how does this apply to teaching, and who's doing the work that relates it to education? And he kind of went, let me think, I don't really know. And then he mentioned the name of two of his colleagues who were more or less doing the work. I mean, I was absolutely livid, because there I was being interpolated as somebody whose work wasn't even worth being mentioned to other students that I could interact with. But I mean, I fought back. I was really, really angry. And as a result of that, and I have to hand it to my supervisor, he really heard me and he understood the kind of disempowerment that I felt. So in order to address that, he asked me, that paper that he'd just given, he was about to go and give in another country as a keynote. And he says, you've done a lot of work in that country. Won't you give me some feedback? You know the audience better than I do. And this is where it becomes really interesting, because I'd read a great deal of what this academic had written for my own studies. Habitually, I had read looking for ideas as students do that I could underline and use for insights to absorb and emulate. Very rarely did I feel confident enough to disagree what was being said in the writing, although the writing was to follow. And when I didn't understand, I assumed that it was my problem, that the weakness was mine, that if I read more, I would eventually come to understand. However, when he put me in the position of a colleague who could give him some feedback, I read in a completely different way. I was no longer mining the text for nuggets. I underlined nothing that was of worth. Instead, I concentrated on how the text could be improved, made clearer, less dense. I used my lack of understanding to suggest where the text needed to be more accessible, particularly for a listening audience. I used everything I knew, from extensive engagement with his other work, to make suggestions. I entered into a dialogue with the text as a result of reading from the empowered position of a collaborative colleague. From this position, I was able to see how my reading practices interpellated me as a student. Even while deliberately resisting that subordinated position that is sometimes given to graduate students, I had unconsciously been interpreted as a submissive reading subject, as a student, rather than as an academic and researcher in my own right. So can you see, I'm consciously resisting the position, but unconsciously I'm acting it out. So it's really important to remember that, oh dear, I've just lost things. It's really important to remember that, that a lot of this happens below the level of consciousness, and that one has to work on oneself to see how it's working. Okay, so now my screen keeps going funny. Let me see. Now I'm going to give you some other examples that are not personal from my own experience. Fan is a Boston stylist, and she wrote an article for the Boston Globe on shopping while being Black, on being followed, ignored, and discredited. And this is what she had to say about it. So she talks about how she always is on guard when she's in retail stores. You know, when she takes things off the rails for her clients that she thinks she will work, she has to be very careful. So she carries a small bag. She wears clothing with minimal pockets. She does not want to be accused of stealing or being there for illegal purposes. So she says, I adopted this technique to deflect suspicion. My hands are visible. I'm a person of color. I adopted this technique early in my career to avoid raising suspicion. If I happen to be racially profiled by store managers and associates who automatically assume I'm in the store to steal, I know it may sound silly, but I've become accustomed to mentally and physically preparing myself for negative or confrontational experiences in stores. So here we see how Fan's entire being is an embodiment of her anticipation of racist interpellations. Similarly, Danielle Johnson, who's a Black attorney in the States who works in the housing court on evictions. She works for people being evicted. And she says, let's just see, sorry. Whoops. I just made that too big. Right. She says, being the only Black attorney in the security line at the Wheatling Housing Courthouse, I definitely get looks. Where's she going? Does she know the line starts back there? Attorneys have to show their ID and barcode. Unless the security guard recognizes me, my barcode usually gets examined more than others. This person thinks I'm supposed to be in a different line. Then I'm free to go. I've passed the first test. It's a series of tests that I have to go through. And I'm not even in the courthouse yet. It's exhausting, these tests. And you see that this is like another form of interpellation. The tenant's line is mainly people of color, who she is there to represent. The white male attorneys are there to represent the housing authorities or the independent landlords. Judges have assumed that she's a tenant or spoken to her white intern instead of her. Court officials tell her that she has to move because where she is sitting is reserved for attorneys. Even her tenants are disappointed and worried that she's not as smart as a white attorney. Each of these acts hail her into a position of inferiority. And it's ironic that she has to constantly refuse the hails that challenge her self-worth at the Edward W. Brooke Courthouse, which is named for the first Black politician from Massachusetts to serve in Congress. It's not just words that interpellate us. It's practices such as these that construct subordinate subject positions for people marginalized race, gender, poverty, sexuality, nationality, ethnicity, religion, education, language, or law. You name it. Okay. So this next slide is just to capture that. Okay. Actions, images, practice, construct these subordinate subject positions. So I went on to Google. I always like doing this on Google. And I typed in Brazil. And these were the first 4 images that came up. Okay, the first 4 images that represent Brazil. This is a COVID image. Okay. This is Rio de Janeiro. And this here you see the map of Brazil. So I'd be interested to know if this is your sense of Brazil, how you are interpolated by the way in which these are the normative images that come up for Brazil. Are you proud of them? Do you think Brazil is more than this or different than this? What is it showing? What isn't it showing? Very often the Google images bring up the hidden assumptions, okay, that are sitting there in the algorithms, what people search for and what they're interested in. Okay, so in the course of his essay, Althusser states that it is essential to realize that both the person writing the lines and the reader who reads them are subjects. So every time you read a text, every time you read a book, every time you read an advertisement, every time you read food packaging, that text is working to position the reader. It would like the reader to take up particular positions rather than other positions. And the ideal reader is somebody who uncomplicatedly takes on the positions on offer in the text. And part of our responsibility as educators is to help students see how texts work to interpolate us, whether they're oral texts or visual texts or practices or embodied ways of talking to people or actual words. So literacy education, in my view, needs to include an understanding of how texts work, whose interests they serve. We need to be aware, not submissive readers who only consciously take up the reading positions on offer without deliberation. And deliberation involves ethical decision-making in taking a stance. So, as readers, We have to be able to read with and against texts. All texts are positioned and positioning, and we need to understand, engage with, and question the positions on offer, whether we agree with them or not. Refusing to take up the positions offered by a text should not simply be a knee-jerk reaction. We have to refuse things that do not serve the interests of social justice, and in reading against them, we have to explain how these texts do not serve the interests of social justice. At the same time, we do have to be able to read with texts. In other words, accept the positions, the interpellations that challenge our taken for granted assumptions, our beliefs, our cultural practices. If we're unable to read with such texts to understand them, how does anyone engage with different perspectives and learn from them? So I'm going to give you a very specific example. Okay, and I'm using the personal again to help you understand. So I'll just give you a chance to have a look at this. It's what I've just discussed with you. This business about reading with and against text. People somehow think that critical literacy is only reading against a text. But how can you read against a text that you haven't engaged with, that you haven't thought about, that you haven't read properly, that you've tried to understand? Then how do you know that what you're interrogating is what the text is actually saying? So you have to be able to move into the text to engage with it, and you have to be able to move out of the text to interrogate it. You have to be able to do both. And I started thinking that maybe people think that reading with the text is literacy, which is why they think that reading against the text is critical literacy. You need both for critical literacy. So, the following extract comes from this book, Me and White Supremacy. This is me trying to work out who I am as a white, middle-class, privileged academic in the age of Black Lives Matter. What is it that I should know? What do I need to think about? Even if I'm a critical literacy person, that doesn't exonerate me from all the advantages and privileges and structural systems that I've benefited from. So in the following extract, so it's by Layla Saad, and it's actually a course that she asks you to put yourself through. So she gives you some input, and then you have to respond to a whole lot of provocations. So the following extract hails white readers as white supremacists, not as people who've benefited from white privilege or who have an unconscious bias, but as people who subscribe to the ideology that white people are superior in many ways to people of other races and that they should be dominant over them. Now, as a critical literacy academic, I found it hard, this positioning of me as a white supremacist, I found really hard to even think about, let alone actually do the work to unpack some of the stuff some of my hidden assumptions that are even hidden to me. So this is the hail that I had to deal with. I'm going to read it because every time I read it, it's really hard. Many white people hear the word white supremacy and think that doesn't apply to me. Okay, that's what I've just told you. But they don't hold that belief, but rather that they believe that all of us are equal, and I don't modify my treatment on the basis of the color of people's skin. But I'm reading this, okay? And she says, what this book will help you to realize, however, is that that isn't true. White supremacy is an ideology, a paradigm, an institutional system, and a worldview that you've been born into by virtue of your white privilege. I'm talking about the historic and modern legislating, societal conditioning, and systemic institutionalization of the construction of whiteness superior to people of other races. White supremacy is a system you have been born into. Whether or not you have known it, it is a system that has granted you unearned privileges, protection, and power. What you receive for your whiteness comes at a steep cost for those who are not white. So this is the stuff that I had to work through. This is an attempt at interpellation. I can resist the interpellation. I can refuse to be positioned in this way. Or I can start to think about the things that I've achieved. How did I get to be a professor? Would I have been a professor if I'd had to go through Black education under apartheid, which some of my colleagues had to do? Would I be a professor if I'd had to study in Zulu and not in English? Many of my Zulu-speaking colleagues had to study in English. I had to go through all the privileges and their effects on me. So she says that claims to colorblindness or to, I'm an exception because I've done anti-racist work, or I'm an exception because I'm married to a Black person, or I have Black friends. Or the feeling that SAD essentializes whiteness. All of these would be typically ways of reading against the text, of refusing the interpellation. Being hailed as a white supremacist is damning. And I, for one, would love to think that it doesn't apply to me. It's hard for me to read with this text, to accept the need to explore my unearned benefits, my unconscious assumptions of being better than, and my complicity in a racist social order, which I have to tell you hasn't disappeared 20 years after democracy and the end of apartheid, because structures are very hard to shift. Structural racism is built into every institution, into my university, into the schooling system, into who has access to healthcare, into who has access to loans and running water. It's very hard to turn that around. But if I and other white people refuse to do this work, how can we change our normative ways of being and doing? How can we learn to recognize when to speak and when to be silent? What counts as cultural appropriation? The effects of dehumanization and colonial dispossession? So that actually deciding to read with or against a text, or deciding whether or not to accept the positions on offer, the hails, is ultimately a moral decision. Gransky argues that there are two ways in which power operates: by coercion or consent. The more we consent to existing power relations, the less force is needed to maintain them. This surely applies equally to transforming existing relations of power. The more we do consent to doing the work necessary to transform our white ways of doing, being, believing, and valuing that reproduce white supremacy, the more Black lives will matter, and the less we will have to be coerced to embrace equality. The institutions that Althusser calls ideological state apparatuses, the family, the church, the school, the media, produce consent. And the repressive state apparatuses, the police, the military, the courts, they coerce submission to power. Having consented, however unconsciously, to the ideology of white supremacy, the time has come for me and others to heed Sartre's call and to understand more deeply than before how the white people embody affects the lives of others, as well as what it means to be Black in a white world. In this way, taking up Sartre's hail, okay, so in this instance, it's morally better to read with the text than to read against the text. In this way, taking up Sartre's hail, accepting the appellation, what she's calling me, it's between her and me. She's calling me into a position, I'm taking it up. It becomes more than just personally liberating, with the potential to produce change towards a more inclusive and racially just social order. At the same time, it's worth noting, okay, that all the personal examples of interpellation that I have remembered and recounted here have been gendered. Male supervisor, male colleague, male relative, all of those are in the context of masculinity and the disempowerment of women. Power is fundamental to the concept, and the personal is political. So accepting the hail sometimes is transformative. Sometimes accepting the hail is not transformative. So I'm going to end on a much lighter note to show you that there are different kinds of hails. I hope this is slide 18. This card was given to me on a birthday. And I think it's important to remember that interpellation happens below the level of consciousness. The friend who gave it to me knows that I have a weakness for shoes. So what it says, I don't know if you can read it, is that suddenly the ozone layer, the plight of the blue whale, the world peace paled into insignificance as one is tempted by the desire of fad shoes. And now more than ever, I think we have to take affect seriously in the way in which people are drawn affectively into particular subject positions, many of which are nowadays beyond reason. Thank you. That's it from me. So, Rivaldo, are you there?
I'm using the chat not to interrupt you, but I understand that you've already finished, okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to take questions, and I'd love to know how people are reacting. It's very strange to give a lecture to a machine.
Yeah, I see, but of course everybody's enjoying. We have some comments here. People, please write on the chat on YouTube so that I can ask her. But we have some comments here. People are amazed to be watching your talk. And let me see, people are happy and honored. But let's go. I have some comments by Leonardo da Silva. He is a professor at the Federal Institute of Santa Catarina. And he says that, I'm going to read his words. I have the impression we need to understand which battles to fight. We see nowadays a proliferation of neo-conservative discourses that aim at censoring teachers. As critical educators, who are seen as dangerous by those who claim education should be neutral, is as if such a thing was possible. We need to be strategic in devising ways of promoting transformation. So it's been a real challenge nowadays, because we have the impression, and not only the impression, in very practical terms. For example, since 2018, students start filming teachers and professors, and then they announce that the teachers or professors are using the left ideology. So there is a term in Portuguese that they use every time you criticize the system, or you talk about inequality, or you talk that we are racist. So these people see this kind of teaching as brainwashing. That's a term that they use, and that's very dangerous. And they say that's why we have such and such problems, because of these people, this kind of teachers, that instead of teaching, I am, you are, he is, she is questioning discourse, is talking about power relationship. And sometimes we feel very afraid that any comment or a text that you bring to the classroom may be seen as some kind of I don't know, that we can even be punished because we are doing something that we are supposed to do. So I want you to comment a little bit on that.
Sure. You know, I started doing this work under apartheid, both in my own classroom and then when I was a teacher educator. I always used to say to my students, you have to do it in a way that means you'll still be there to do it tomorrow. Okay? Because, I mean, we had spies in our classrooms, you know, police spies. We had, similar to what you're describing, you know, we had police spies in the classrooms. We had, our organizations were banned, our teachers' organizations were banned. It was tough times, you know, so I do understand what you're saying, and it was terrifying. I mean, I was a young mother. I had to work with my husband and decide what we would do if I got arrested, you know. So there are a couple of things I can say about that. The thing is, first of all, I'm going to describe the problem in a slightly different way, which I don't know the answer. And then I'm going to tell you like some of the things that we did or that my students did that enabled us to show up again tomorrow. Okay. So, I was just talking to a friend recently. Certainly Western education, and of course, post-colonial countries heavily influenced by Western education, is predicated on the Enlightenment. You know, it's our job to teach critical thinking, to teach argument, to teach evidence, to teach students to substantiate their points of view. And suddenly, that kind of thinking is out the window. You know, you have a president in America who can say you can't trust scientists, and in the next breath he says we'll have a vaccine by the end of the year. Well, you know, who does he think is going to produce the vaccine? So you know, sitting there is like a fundamental contradiction, which goes against rational thinking. So we're sitting in an age where we're expected to teach kids to think critically, but fact and reason are out the window. So it's even more complicated in a way than when we were, you know, like trying to teach alternative history or alternative approaches to literature or whatever. So we worked on a number of fronts. One of the things that we did was we got ourselves involved in the official syllabus committees. We got people onto those committees that were writing the curriculum. And then we went for small goals. So one of our goals was to include South African literature in the curriculum, because in those days it was only British literature. because we knew that if the curriculum said you could teach South African literature, we could teach anti-apartheid novels and poems, many of whom were being written by Black poets and Black writers. So we had to create a kind of official space, a sort of crack in the curriculum where we could insert some of the stuff that we wanted to do, okay? So that was one thing that we did. The other thing that we did is we also worked on an alternative curriculum. So some of us were involved in what was called people's education. I mean, that's where I started developing critical literacy materials. We didn't think those materials were ever going to be in the classroom. But you know, the kids were out on boycott. They weren't in classrooms. They were educating each other under trees. So we thought, you know, we'd circulate this material under the radar. But, you know, we worked on both fronts, on the official curriculum and on the alternative curriculum. Or we would take the official Nationalist Party history books, which are all about what the white settlers and the empty country, and you know, all told from the point of view of the colonizer and the conquest of the country. But then there were people who were working on alternative history. We would give them the one history, we'd give them the other history, and then we'd say, so now when you write your final examinations, which version of history do you think you're going to have to give as your answer? So that if people question why we were doing the alternative, it would be so that they could understand what the official version was better. Okay? But in actual fact, they were getting the alternative version that they wouldn't otherwise have got. And if you say to them, which one do you think you're going to have to write in the exam? And we'd say, why? There's your critical question. Or we would come at it another way. We'd take something that's in the curriculum and we'd swap words. We'd take it out of passive voice and put it into active voice, or if it was written about white people, we'd turn it into Black people. And we'd say, well, you know, how does this change the meaning of the text? And then you could always say that, you know, Saussure says you see what something is by seeing what it's not. So it's important for students to see what it's not so that they can understand what is. Do you know what I'm getting at? We played it very clever. So one has to be able to defend what one's doing in terms of the powers that be, but nevertheless to do it in ways that are slippery, you know, that they can't completely nail you. And then, of course, the other thing is to do it in a way that is interesting and fascinating for kids. Because if the kids are really with you and other kids, you know, other students go off ratting and stuff, they've got to deal with peer pressure. So, you know, if you can, a lot of it depends on your relationship with the students as to your level of safety. So, but you're never safe, and it's much better not to do it on your own. It's much better to do it as a school or a university or a department or with several colleagues. It's much harder to hit an individual than to take out a whole group. So one does have to be extremely strategic in some very difficult situations. The problem now is that the more you point out that this is not a fact, the more the fact sticks. You know, so once facts are undermined, it's very difficult for educators, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your comment and your answer. Patricia Martins mentioned that we've been facing an ethical crisis in relation to it because we have our principles, but we kind of feel very restrained in what to do and how people will interpret. Because it seems nowadays, as you've mentioned, that we have so many contradictory facts. Let's pick up one, for example, that the current government, the president of Brazil and his government, they don't value education. But many of his ministers, at least 5 of his ministers, they lied about graduate courses. So they haven't taken, one minister said that she had 2 master's degrees and she didn't have none. Another one said that he was a doctor and he was not. His PhD dissertation wasn't approved. And then, so it's so very contradictory because they don't value education at all. And then they are lying about having diplomas that they don't have. So, and of course, it's the same thing in the discourse change for one side to the other without making any sense at all, just because of some business or some interest or some new partner that they found. So things are really complicated right now. But go ahead, please.
So, Gisvelda, I would say that, like another strategy is to go and find examples of contradictions in everyday texts. So you'll find a cereal box selling food that tells you this is good for kids and it's healthy, and then you'll see all the sugar in it and all the starch, and then you ask the student to find the contradiction. Okay, then you say to them, now you go and find some other contradiction, and then they will go out and they will bring them into class. Okay, then the teacher's not so much in the firing line. You want the students to go and collect the contradictory texts that are worrying them, and what they have to do is they have to come back into class and they have to explain why it's a contradictory text. Where's the contradiction? So that you sort of make them aware of contradiction in my work. I make a distinction between little p politics and big P politics. And when big P politics is very dangerous, like you're talking about the government, about global warming, and you're talking about COVID and not giving out statistics and all of that. That's all big P politics. But when you start to talk about, who takes out the garbage, is it a man or a woman? Why is this a woman's job? Okay. Or you talk about cereal boxes, and then you teach the concept of contradiction or whatever, and then you ask the kids to do it. So they start noticing contradictions and can explain why it's contradictory. It's almost like we have to go back to teaching kids how to make an argument and how to find evidence. So you want to do it with stuff that's not immediately big P politics, but where the kids can, for themselves, make the connection, even in class, because you're not responsible for what kids say in class. You've asked them to find a contradiction. They brought this one. I don't know if that's making sense, but I mean, one has to think very smartly about what the kids need to know, what they need to be able to do, and then how to move from small P politics to big P politics.
That's perfect. Another teacher, Gasparin actually, Ramalho, he says that denying privilege through the speech of equality is a strategy used by many white people.
I worked hard for what I've got. I worked hard. I didn't just get these results because I'm white. I studied hard, I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah. And because we have like some people denying, I've just heard about the one of the candidates for mayor. He's running for mayor of Porto Alegre, which is the capital of Rio Grande do Sul. And he said that there is no such a thing here as racism, as feminicide, as prejudice against gays, lesbians, and everything. So he says everybody in peace, everything is equal. So for because we had a very tragic incident at a supermarket involving a black man. And then he said, no, this is an exception. This is an exception. We don't have this kind of things here. So you completely deny everybody's equal here. The president, he has said so many times that he doesn't like black people, that black people are lazy, that his sons will never marry woman, and etc., etc., etc. And then 1 week ago, he said that he's blind. He can't see people's skin. It doesn't make any difference for him. It just matters if the person is good or bad. But he can't. He said that he is, oh my goodness, daltonic. So he can see colors. And I say, how come he has been in the Congress for like 30 years and he has been repeating racist sentences all over his career, and out of the blue, no, I'm not racist. I can even see people's skin color. I can even see that. So you get, and some people say, yeah, true, you see our president, how it doesn't make sense at all. So I think it goes in that direction. And I'm so sorry. I just want to conclude here with a comment on Selma, and then I'll give you the floor, of course. She mentions about the concept of interpellation, that it must be better understood in order for teachers to work with it in their classrooms. And it's one possibility of critical literacy, especially during this difficult time we've been facing. Okay? And then please, let me see, we still have, okay. And people are saying that they need to study more a little bit about it. And okay, Juliana is telling, I guess, the story of my life. She said the narrative reminded me of an excellent book I've read, Reading Lolita in Freedom. No. I'm sorry. And then Juliana is telling, because my mother is black and from northwest of Brazil, and my father is white and Italian descendant. In my case, it's all the way around. Like my mother's white, my father's black. So this kind of things are very complicated.
É importante.
I'm so sorry. I'm terrible sorry, but my son is here and somehow he keeps interrupting me.
It's refreshing.
I'm so sorry. Professor Janks, I want to thank you very much. If you want to make some closing comment here, but it was a real pleasure to hear you, to listen to you, and to identify and to see so many perspectives for us to work critically and to help our students to be more aware of these things, these contradictions. So it's something that we do need to do, because when we look around today, it seems like we went back 30, 40 years ago, the minimum, because it seems that conservative and really conservative people, I feel like they are feeling threatened. Okay, so somebody else is going to take a place that belongs to me, that this place belongs to me. So I guess there's so much hatred and so much tension nowadays. So it's really important to have this kind of thing right now.
Okay. The one thing that I want to say that I didn't really talk about, but I think might be really helpful for people who are part of your community, because you said you do a lot of work with engineers. space and the organization of space and the design of buildings also call us into particular subject positions. So I wrote an article with a colleague describing the building that I work in that was actually built by a prison architect, the architect who designed apartheid prisons. And it's designed like a panopticon. There's this big space and all the balconies around it. You can see what the students are doing wherever you are. They're completely exposed in this open space as they walk across it. And from the open space, you can see what people are doing on the balconies and stuff. So it's really important to think about how space is organized, how buildings are organized, how architecture forces us to take certain routes or separates people or includes people or is welcoming or distancing. All of those are forms of positioning. And in fact, if I think about interpellation, it's just a concept that helps one to think about how positioning works. All texts, oral, spoken, buildings, architecture, visual images, invite us into particular subject positions. And as readers or viewers or listeners, we can take up those subject positions or not. And I think that is the skill that we have to give students. And the trouble is that, the stuff can be perverted. So if you don't have the social justice question to help you make the decision about whether or not to take up the position, who's included, who's excluded, is this fair, who benefits, who's disadvantaged, then it's quite hard to know when to accept the hail and when to refuse the hail.
Thank you very much, Professor Hilary Janks. The article that your presentation is based will be published. When will it be published?
It's coming out in a book. I'll send you the details and you can send it around. Okay, I don't know, it should come out next year early. It's being published by Dennis Sumara from Canada and Donna Alverman. And it's a book that has invited a whole lot of academics to talk about a key concept from a personal perspective. So I would imagine some of the other articles will do the kind of work that I've done with the concept that I chose. They're all critical literacy scholars who are working with a concept that has meant something to them in relation to their work in critical literacy. So I'll send you the details now. In fact, why don't I just put it in here? Hang on a second. I can put, so Sumara, I'll put it in here, then people can look for it. It's Sumara, Dennis, and Alverman. I mean, Donna's very well known. Alverman D. Ideas that changed literacy practices. And then, of course, you've got to have a colon. Wouldn't be an academic text if it didn't have a colon. Leading voices from the field. And it's going to be published by Myers Education Press. Leading voices. Oh, leading voices from the field, I think, not for the field, from the field.
Did you write it on the YouTube chat?
Yeah, I'm doing that.
Yeah, I can see, probably I can see them, but I believe, okay. All right. So,
Great. Thank you very much.
thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you. We are supposed to be at Ouro Preto. It would be a real pleasure to have you in Brazil, but let's set something for the 4th Abraditech International Seminar. So it'll be a pleasure to see you, to meet you personally, and to listen to you. Maybe the book will be out, so we'll be read and have some more deep discussion on that. And I get very happy because we started our seminar with a brilliant Brazilian linguist and researcher, and we went up with a brilliant South African linguist, and we've been reading your books, my goodness, since, or your articles and work since I was in college. So it's been a while, and it's a real pleasure to have you in our seminar, and thanking you for adapting and with this changing and being here with us.
Okay, one of the things that I can tell you, let me just put it at www. Hilary Janks. What is my website? If you just Google Hilary Janks, you'll find my website. I
have it here.
Okay, and why it's useful is I do try to put all my articles up there. So, you know, especially for people in the political South, it's sometimes very hard for us to get hold of articles. So I just try and make them available if anybody's interested. They're all there. It's
I'm going to write on the chat. There is a publication page on your website, and I've just put it there, so you have lots of materials there. Doing critical literacy, literacy and power, and then you have some articles here, so that makes...
there it is. No, that's my email address. Okay, if people need to get hold of me, and if people don't know the books, that's what they are. But really, the most accessible for free is what's on the website, because academic books are so expensive. You know,
okay.
$4
Thank you very much for that, for making them available for free as well. So thank you very much, Professor Janks. We are really happy with your talk. It's really food for thought, and we hope contributing to the education in our country as well. So have a very nice afternoon, not really, because it's night already there, right, in South Africa. So you are 5 hours ahead. So thank you also for working so hard and so late in order to be part of our seminar.
It's a real pleasure, and it's been a pleasure meeting you. And I'm sorry I couldn't meet the audience, but they love you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Pessoal, então, muitíssimo obrigado para aqueles que participaram do nosso seminário, para que compartilharam os trabalhos de vocês, que enriqueceram esses momentos com perguntas e contribuíram. A gente vai ter agora um sorteio de livros, a gente está um pouquinho atrasado, né, mas a gente tem um sorteio de materiais. Acredito que o site, a página ali do Meet já esteja aberta, e aí a gente passa para essa etapa. Eu vou pedir 2 minutinhos, já vou abrir a sala e aí a gente inicia. So, thank you, Professor Hilary. Thank you, all the audience, people who are attending. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.